I used to, thank you. I used to live in Malaysia and work here for 3.5 years. And I taught philosophy and comparative religion. So I'm familiar with your country, and I'm very happy to be back here to talk here. I'd like to thank Dato Farouk for the invitation, and also for Ihsan, who met me in Oxford when I was giving a lecture there on the comparison between revelation in Islam and revelation in Christianity. I met him there about 6 months ago. And the recently acquired Dr. Junaid, Ahmad, whose father I knew and in whose honor I'm going to be talking tomorrow. So I'm very happy to be back here in Malaysia to give this talk on this subject. Now, it's true that philosophy is a very glamorous subject in a way. And of course, as you know, in our culture, by which I mean Pakistani culture, you know, people don't encourage their children to go and become philosophers because of the legitimate anxiety of how will they earn a living. You know, most people from working class backgrounds like myself would study to be engineers or doctors, which is are safe professions, which means you can get a job in them. So philosophy is intellectually a big adventure for me. I was interested when I was 17, 18. I went to Cambridge to study philosophy, and not Islamic philosophy, but philosophy. Yeah? The subject itself. Of course, I'm a Muslim myself, and therefore I'm interested in Islamic philosophy too, but it's not something that I studied at Cambridge. There it was just pure analytical philosophy, the kind of stuff that we're going to be dealing with today. So that's my background. I should add, by the way, that on the question of philosophy as a subject and its value, I think that if you are a jurist, or a religious scholar, or an alim, like Dr. Tajul Islam is, in a sense, people take seriously what you say. One of the great occupational privileges of being a philosopher is that nobody understands what you say, and therefore are not likely to execute you for saying something that they disagree with. So I would like to say that there are perhaps limits to the influence that philosophers have. I mean, philosophers have, in Western culture, had some degree of influence, admittedly, indirectly. Let's say someone like Aristotle. But I don't think Islam is the kind of culture that allows philosophers or thinkers to have influence. You know, لِقَوْمِ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ is your slogan for people who think. But I think that, and here it might sound a bit controversial to say this, but it seems to me actually that one of the reasons for the vibrancy and virility, if you like, of Islamic culture and civilization is, apart from the fact that Islam is the youngest universal faith, it's only 1400 years old, which is much younger than Christianity and Judaism, I think is that in Islam people have always valued, both in Shia and Sunni Islam, martyrs above thinkers. And I don't think that's necessarily a wrong thing, by the way, if I'm fair. I mean, I don't see that the Quran eulogizes philosophers in that way. I mean, it wasn't revealed to the Greeks, after all. It was revealed to 7th century Arabs, for whom poetry and language were very important arts. And it does emphasize the need, under certain circumstances, for laying down one's life as a witness to God, both for justice and for other causes, meaning promoting the cause of God. So I don't want to exaggerate the status of the philosopher. I hope I'm being fair in saying what I've said from an Islamic point of view, because I'm not only a philosopher, but a Muslim philosopher. So I had to add that bit. Now, on to the subject of today's talk. Let me set the parameters for this to explain to you what the problem is. Yeah. Think of a dramatic case here. The silence of God question. You know, the fact that after the revelation of the Quran in the early 7th century, there's been no explicit revelation after the Quran, meaning the finality of the Arabic Quran. Yeah, that the Quran in Arabic is the final word of God. So there are mystics who may claim, wahi, which is a lesser form of tanzil, who might say, they've had some communication. But the idea of an explicit revelation from God, including law and ethics, of the kind that Dr. Taj has been discussing, what the Quran says, Islam does affirm that. Therefore, in a sense, the silence of God is a corollary or a consequence of the fact that the final book has arrived. If God has spoken for the last time, decisively and clearly, why should he speak again? So it's not actually a puzzle in Islam, but it is a puzzle, theologically speaking, in other revealed religions which are associated with or cousins of Islam, meaning the Judeo-Christian tradition. So that's actually the reason why I'm interested in this question about the silence of God, if you like. But I'd like to extend it to the silence of Allah, meaning of the Islamic God monotheism, and give you comparisons both with the Jewish notion of why God is silent, if you like, after the Holocaust, and with the Christian idea of why the silence of God creates certain problems. For example, the absolutely astonishing amount of brutality that the 20th century has witnessed, not just in the Holocaust, but for Muslims, the Bosnian Holocaust. I was in Bosnia recently, and I'm sure you're all aware of the harrowing details of brutality that Muslim men and women suffered under Serbian aggression. So the fact that God can witness these things and not break his silence is actually a puzzle, I think, mainly the Judeo-Christian tradition, but also in Islam. One of the reasons why we in Islam do not regard it as a puzzle, even though I myself do, is that we do not actually, in our tradition, have any sustained discussion of the problem of evil the way that Jews and Christians have done. Not saying there's been no attempt at it, but Islam has never really engaged that issue of the problem of evil. It's been thought that it's self-evident why there's evil. Human beings have free will. God has made us with the capacity to do wrong, and we do wrong when we exercise that free will. So what's so puzzling about evil in the world? It simply means an exercise of the prerogative of Bani Adam to exercise his or her will, and therefore have the right to do what is wrong. Of course, you'll be punished for it, but the moment God has given you respite, meaning a life of 60, 70, 80 years, then after that he'll take account. So that's the reason for the interim evil in the world, that we are exercising our freedom. So in that sense, it's not an issue for us. But here is a dramatic way that I'd like to plant this thought experiment in your minds. I want you to think about this question. Suppose someone says that Muslims, like Jews and Christians, believe in the providence of God, which is the Quranic claim and the biblical claim that God is provided for human beings. And the Quran particularly emphasizes this fact that through the ayat Allah, through the signs of God, you can see that even in the routine sequences of the world, of nature, the change of seasons, the way you plant a seed and it grows, nothing miraculous, just routine, thing that farmers do. How is it that God has provided for you for this excellent providence, and yet you are ungrateful for it? That's a very central Quranic question. Why will you not give thanks? Right? Qalilan ma tashkurun. Little of the thanks they give. Qalilan ma tadhakkarun. Little is the reflection they do. It's actually a rhymed kind of pair in Islam, used in different surahs. So this is a central Quranic enigma that God is sort of rhetorically asking. Of course, God knows the answer. Rhetorically asking, why aren't you grateful? A bit like you might say to an ungrateful spouse or an ungrateful child, look at how much I do for you. How come you're not grateful? Yeah, that's the question that's being asked. Now, the interesting question here is that let's suppose a modern secular humanist, and this is something I'll touch on, because I think the modern secular humanist is not a kafir or a mushrik in the old sense, which creates a big theological puzzle as to who the modern secular humanist is. But let's suppose such a person who completely denies all the supernatural, not just denies the God of Islam, but denies all notions of divinity and supernatural, demons, angels, a whole world that is beyond the natural. Let's suppose such a person says to you something very challenging. He says to you, you had a very wonderful meal last night. You ate, fruit, apples, you drank something, non-alcoholic, of course. Now, while you were eating that food, do you know that X number of children starved to death while you were enjoying that meal at the Hotel Concorde? Now, it's a very distressing thing, right, isn't it? Now, of course, if you're a Muslim and you say rather glibly, confidently, you say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides for everybody in the whole world, please don't make such arrogant, insulting comments. The secular humanist says, but I'm only telling you a fact, that while you enjoyed your meal and you said at the end of it as a good Muslim, shukr, alhamdulillah, bil alamin, for this wonderful meal, and you look around you and you say, baldatun tayyibatun wa rabbun ghafur, I'm very happy here. Have you considered the world in which you live? This is your environment in which all these wonderful bounties of God have taken place. What about the fact that a mere, let's say, 1 hour's flight away, people are starving? How do you explain that? Where is the providence of God? That's the question that I'd like to be able to answer in my puzzle today. I hope you think it's a sufficiently worthy question, right? It isn't actually as easy as it seems to answer this question. So I'll explain to you what method I would use. And this is something that goes back in my thinking, if I may mention a couple of my works on this, to immediately after my doctorate, which was on a Christian existentialist philosopher called Soren Kierkegaard, I wrote a book called A Faith for All Seasons, in which one of the chapters actually asks this question. It doesn't necessarily solve it, but I asked this question. And as recently as this month, an article by myself is being published in a journal called Renovatio, the Latin word for reform or renovation, which is being published by Al Zaytuna, the first liberal arts college, Muslim college. I think you may have heard of Hamza Yusuf. They invited me as a philosopher to ask and answer, if possible, this question. So that's the parameters of it. Anyone, by the way, before I start exploring this in a bit more depth, does anyone think that they actually know the answer? That it's quite a simple one. It's not really an issue. Because our philosophers are kind of an intellectual pastime for them to invent problems and then try to solve them, right? So I want to know if any of you think this is a real question or it's not really an important question, as posed by the humanist. And then I'll tell you a bit about my intellectual journey as to why these questions interest me, and then I'll say a bit about the nature of natural theology and how I've tried to resolve this theological question. Anyone think that the answer is rather obvious, theologically speaking? Maybe they can quote a verse from the Quran to me and say, there's your answer. Why are you wasting your time, as a philosopher, trying to answer that unnecessary question? Anyone got any views on that? My God, silence of God. This is the silence of the people. Everyone seems quiet. What's the matter? Yeah? Is it an issue that doesn't trouble you? It does trouble you? Yeah. I mean, have people sort of, rather gracelessly, bluntly challenge you, as I have been challenged, because I actually did my, my advanced research under an atheist philosopher. I did this deliberately. I wanted to choose somebody to supervise me who would challenge me, my Islamic convictions. And the result was that I began to understand the mind of the atheist. Right? And of course, I already have the mind of a believer, so that kind of schizophrenia, mental schizophrenia, is very helpful as a thinker to be able to entertain two completely different ideas. Yeah, I mean, most people only entertain one mental paradigm. Like, they're simply believers, devout believers, like my mother who's illiterate. It wouldn't make any sense to her to ask such a question. She's a devout woman, but she's not learned. So these mental questions won't arise in her mind, yeah? And then for the atheist who's a practicing atheist, let's say someone like Salman Rushdie only knows the lifestyle of a secular humanist, basically thinks religion is silly, juvenile, childish, and anyone beyond the age of 6 or 7 has outgrown it. But when you've got both mentalities simultaneously, where you can understand the mind of the atheist, why he's asking or she's asking, yet you're a believer, then what I did was, after the Faithful Seasons, I wrote a very recent work, relatively recent work, about a decade ago, called The Qur'an and the Secular Mind, which is a major treatise, quite substantial piece of writing, in which I look at the entire Qur'an and look at every single verse in it which may give offense to an atheist, to a devout secular humanist who reads the book and says, no, I don't believe this. For example, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ, I don't like this bit, لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. It's very offensive. Right? No, I'm just talking about how an atheist may read, yeah? Okay. Hudal al-muttaqin is meaningless because there are no muttaqin, because there's no God. Now, if you read the book in that way, meaning you put yourself in the position of answering an extreme challenge to your faith and then tried your best to answer it. Whether I've succeeded or not, that is something for you to judge if you read the book, right? Where I, look at all the key verses of the Quran which may give, not necessarily offense, but which may perplex the atheist and might say, because, the Islamic claim is that the book is a challenge to anyone with a good mind, right? Not just to a Muslim. The book is addressed to mankind, as well as, of course, subgroups within it, like the muttaqin, right? Or atqa, the most pious. But, it's also for Bani Adam. The Quran uses the Quran never uses the ethnic address, Ya ayyuhal Arab, right? Or Arab. It always uses Bani Israel, or Bani Israel certainly, in Surah Baqarah 4 times, or Bani Adam, the children of Adam. It's a very universal address. So if it's addressed to the atheist, and the atheist is reading it, imagine the atheist reading it, and he hasn't even got to the verses about women, right? Where he gets really angry now. Men are in charge of women. Oh my God, Kawwamuna. This is unbelievable. I can't believe it. Morally, this book is offensive to me. Intellectually, it's difficult for me to accept some of its claims. You see the kind of puzzles that may arise. Now, the question is how, I've just chosen one particular issue here, which I'm going to address. But first, I want to ask you to enter into the mind of the modern atheist and then answer this question. When Islam's motto is repeated in a shahada, yeah, the dual testimony of the faith, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. So you say, I believe there is no God except the only God. Now, of course, the atheist says, ashhadu an la ilaha, there is no God. Yes, I stop there. This is good, right? I can't accept the continuation of it. Yeah, I say, true, yeah. And of course, the bit about the prophet being the messenger of God is a meaningless addendum for such a person, because he doesn't believe in God. Now, what's he actually doing when a person said this in 7th century Arabia, and when an atheist who becomes a Muslim says it today? What's the mental difference? It's a huge difference. To say that there's no God except God when you're dethroning all the false divinities. Remember the Meccan pantheon? Yeah? Hubal, various gods. Some of them, certainly none of them named by there except the idols of the people of Noah, who are actually named in the Quran, as you know. And of course in satanic verses, Surah Najm, there's the mention of the goddesses. So you're dethroning something and then saying all that remains on the throne is the Zul Jalali wal Ikram, the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yeah? So you've dethroned. That's the way in which you arrive at the kalima. Now, if you're an atheist, you're not dethroning any realities in coming to the only God, because you don't believe in the category of God with a small g. In English, we have the small g, which indicates deity, because in English, we have the idiomatic expression about a person. If you say, look, that man's a very good, devout Muslim, and the cynic says, no, he's not. Pleasure is his God, small g, yeah? You understand that idiom, right? It'd be harder to translate that into Arabic, although it does actually occur in the Quran, where the Quran says, have you considered the man whose own whim and desire is his ilah, is his God? Yeah, it's a kind of secular. In this particular verse, I believe it's in Surah Furqan, it can be put to a modern secular analysis. But the difficulty is that nobody actually thinks of themselves in that way, of whom you make the accusation. Let me explain what I mean by that. Then I'll come back to the question about this puzzle about the providence of God and how we can resolve it through natural and revealed theology. If you go into a mosque and you're praying, and let's suppose that during the prayer you are distracted by some secular thought, like the size of your bank balance. You're worried that you don't have much money, right, to pay your next, whatever necessary bills. Now that could invalidate your prayer because you are, distracted from the remembrance of God. But on that criterion, I suspect most of us have had our prayers ruined on occasion by extraneous distracting thoughts, which shouldn't be there, but they are there, right? It's very puzzling why this should happen. You're in the presence of the creator of the universe and you're thinking about some trivial matter such as you forgot to lock your car or your bank balance. So this is something that is very bizarre actually about us human beings, that we are, capable of distraction, satanic temptation, more serious thoughts which are wrong and which nullify the prayer. Now if you say of such a person, that person there who's worrying about his bank balance, his God is money with a capital M, or what's called mammon, M-A-M-M-O-N, the Aramaic word for the God of wealth, which is used in the New Testament. That you're not worshipping the true God, you're worshipping a false God. But the problem is that secular humanists do not worship a false God. They simply don't worship any kind of God, true or false. If you say to someone, your true God is, reason with a capital R, yeah? Like, for example, the rationalist philosophers would say that they worship. But the point is the word worship is used metaphorically here. Worship doesn't mean that they're doing salat formally to reason with a capital R. So, in a sense, there are no intentional idolaters, right? Unintentional idolatry, unintentional hidden idolatry, you can make an accusation that somebody's guilty of shirk khafi, a hidden idolatry, that they say that they worship God, but actually their real worship is money or sex or pleasure, because you're looking at their behavior. You're making a judgment. But that's not the person's own self-image. I don't know of anybody who's a bad Muslim, sinful Muslim, which is, I suspect most of us are, who would say, yeah, I worship money, I worship reason. The only people who say that, the only people who are literal idolaters, as opposed to simply being accused of it by other people, are Satanists. There's a Church of Satan in America where the Satanists actually say that I prefer to worship the devil rather than God. Now that person is an actual idolater. He or she is a mushrik. But when we accuse each other of shirk, as people do in polemical circles, they say, oh, so-and-so thinks he's a very good Muslim. His real passion in life is money. He's a mushrik, he's associating something. It's actually a metaphorical usage. It doesn't really mean that you are actually physically going home to your room, putting up an idol of mammon, wealth, right? Or maybe a logo of Walmart and, worshipping it, right? That would be odd if somebody did that. That would be an example of actual intentional idolatry. And I'm saying most people aren't like that. So keep in mind that the person asking this very tough question is actually a real disbeliever, right? Not simply a misbeliever. Misbeliever is the ancient idea where you do not get the object of devotion right. You get it wrong by transferring it to an idol of wood and stone. The real God is invisible and has majesty. You are a disbeliever. You actually say there is no God because there couldn't be one. There's no supernatural realm. When we die, we rot. We don't go to hell. We don't go to heaven. That's the type of person I'm talking about. A polemical atheist, somebody who's very confident of their atheism. And there's a growing number of such people, incidentally, in the Western world, especially with people with my work. In philosophy departments, almost everybody's an atheist. And an atheist of this category, of this pedigree. Yeah, someone who's very hard to convince, because first you'd have to persuade them that there is a supernatural realm. Then let's talk about God and demons and angels. First, is there a supernatural realm? That's the type of person we talk about. Now, if such a person says there's no providence of God, what do you say to him? What about the starving children while we were talking? Right now, while we were talking, some number of people have starved to death. How do we save this dogma article of the fact that God has provided for the human race? Has God provided for the human race or not? Can I have a show of hands on this question? If you are Muslims, how many of you think that God has in fact provided? Not merely potentially, but actually. Meaning that the accusation is unfair. I'm saying that how many of you feel that God has in fact provided, in fact, not merely potentially, for all the people of the world, for every life that comes into the world? Remember, we have this somewhat sentimental view vis-a-vis, birth and natural planning. People would say, it doesn't matter if somebody has 10 children or 12 children, God has already provided for them. So the humanist says, well, look at the fact that of those 10 children, 6 of them have starved to death, infant mortality rate. How do you answer that person? What do you have to do to answer that question? Thank God. So much silence in this room. I'm very surprised. Yeah. Yeah? Any ideas? Any thoughts occurring in your mind if you're challenged? Yeah? Sorry? Well, yes, of course. You can take refuge in what in Latin is called exit in mysterium. About anything you don't know, you say, Allah knows best. Yeah, that's fine. It's not actually a wrong response. But obviously the humanist is not impressed. He'll just leave the room. He'll say, this is not going anywhere. Yeah, he wants, to be... Now, one possibility, let me just propose this idea, is that as a believer, right, you could say, well, the dogma of God's providence is true as a human project, meaning this is a duty imposed on us. Doesn't the Quran frequently say about disbelievers that they do not urge each other to feed the poor? That's almost one of the signs of Iman, actually, in the early Meccan revelations, that they do not urge upon everyone the feeding of the poor. It's almost as if it's a project laid upon believers, that you should be feeding the poor as an active duty and earning a merit. So if you say, well, as a dogma, as an article of faith, the providence of God is untrue, sounds very outrageous to say that as a believer, although coming immediately after Dr. Taj, I can't imagine saying anything outrageous compared to what he's been saying. But imagine if you did say that. You said, well, as a dogma it's not true, but as a human project that God has laid upon the believer, it can be made to be true. Yeah? That would be one answer. Of course, it's within faith. So what you've done is you've subtly altered the status of this belief of this belief in the providence of God from being an article of iman or faith on a par with I believe in God and the books and the angels, to saying, well, it's a human project. And if there are people starving, it's a human failing. It means we haven't done our job as believers if there are people starving in the world. Because potentially there's enough food. It's a question of distribution. Is that a reasonable answer, do you think? I mean, the atheist may not be satisfied. But are you satisfied as believers with that answer? Anyone think that that's a fair answer as a believer, meaning from within the parameters of faith? Anyone? Dr. Walid, you satisfied? Happy?
I think really the main idea in this case is how we understand the vision of God and this type of thing.
Okay.
It might not be the answer.
Right. Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
View. I think Islam puts emphasis on the agency of the human being.
Right.
The human being is playing a key role.
Sure. Certainly. Yeah. Right.
Whether everything is provided, yes, you have enough wealth to cover
Right.
everybody. You have enough things to cover everybody. But the duty of the human being is to make proper distribution, to make less evil and this type of things.
Right.
So it's
Okay.
kind of the idea of the Dato that
Yeah.
Quran is mentioning.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Let me introduce a couple of more dimensions to this debate. Yeah? Yeah, please. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So that I think it is demanded of him to share whatever
Yeah.
excesses that he has,
Right.
or anything that is more than his needs.
Absolutely. Yeah.
To share with the less
Yeah.
unfortunate.
Yeah, and of course a big emphasis in the Quran and the prophetic traditions. You know, the man who goes to bed with his stomach filled while his neighbor goes hungry. Right? You know, we have tremendous amount of exhortation from the Holy Prophet ﷺ about the fact that we need to feed people. So you're right. You know, we could answer it in that way. Now, yeah, please go ahead. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
We should, in principle,
Yeah. Yeah.
whatever excesses or whatever little we have, we should
Yeah.
be grateful.
Yes.
Whatever extra you have to share with the less fortunate.
Yes, absolutely. You've summed it up so well. In the past, in Christianity as well as in Islam, particularly with the Muslim philosophers who were often inspired by an alien tradition, there was this idea that unaided human reason, aql, without the benefit of revelation, could demonstrate the goodness, the existence, the power, and the presence of a single almighty being, God. This is a common project. It's called natural theology, meaning you rely upon natural reason. The opposite of that is called revealed theology, meaning you look inside a scripture, let's say the Quran or the two testaments of the Bible, or those bits of the Bible which are considered apocryphal, meaning not canonical, not sahih, but disputed, but by Catholics considered as being acceptable, but by Protestants rejected. You look into them and you say, look, here are arguments for the existence and power of a single God, of one deity who rules the world. Now these two types of theology, natural and revealed, I have actually questioned this distinction in the case of the Holy Quran. I believe that this distinction is alien to Islam, and like Dr. Taj was saying about issues of the clergy and Reformation, some of the things we may uncritically borrow from Christian analogues are not necessarily true. And I actually personally think that it isn't in fact the case that we have this distinction, because it seems to me, and people can challenge me on this, that the Quran actually contains both revealed theology, that's of course simply an obvious fact because of revelation, but it also contains a potential natural theology, because the Quran, unique among revelations, contains a great deal of literature, a great deal of verses about the ayat Allah, about the signs of God, a kind of an optimistic epistemology that says that you can read off things and evidences from the appearances of nature, This is a frequent Quranic emphasis. In fact, the range of the word ayah, which I've analyzed in my book, The Quran, the Secular Mind, is absolutely astonishing. And that's excluding modern Arabic ideas of something being a token of something else. Yeah? But just the Quranic range. I mean, just think, what the Quran says about the ayat, the range of them. Surah Rum, for example, mentions lots of these ayat, and they range from things like events in nature to the claim that God has placed love and affection between the genders. Right? That's an ayah for a people who think. The fact that men and women are inclined to have affection for each other is a divine sign. It's a very remarkable thing to claim. Because, of course, on a purely biological reason or aesthetic reasoning, a poet who's totally secular might say, well, I feel affection for my wife or my girlfriend, but I don't think it's a sign of God. I don't see how you can read God from this. You see what I'm saying? The way that you make that step as a believer is not available to a disbeliever. And then something even more remarkable is that a prophet such as Zachariah, for example, in Surah 19 says to God, Rabbi Jalli ayah, my Lord, assign a sign for me. Now, of course, he asks this with great boldness, because he says, I've never been unblessed in my prayer to you. Of course, I can't say to God in a given situation of calamity, my Lord, assign a sign for me that things will turn out right. I can't say that. I'm simply not pious enough, and I haven't acquired a reputation for enough learning and piety. But a prophet can say that. It's an intimate relationship. But look at the fact that a pious man is saying this, right? And then in Surah Yusuf, you get this interesting comment just before the narrative actually begins properly. It says, لَقَدْ كَانَ فِي يُوسُفَ وَإِخْوَاتِهِ آيَاتٌ لِلسَّائِلِينَ. In Joseph and his brothers, there are signs for the inquirers. Well, the signs are only for the inquirers, firstly. Yeah? Not necessarily for the casual, ignorant person who doesn't think. But the really interesting fact about this, now I'm fine for water, and I don't need love either, by the way. I'm fine on both scores. The really interesting thing is, that the implication of that verse is that the presence of God, the goodness of God, the guidance of God can reside in an evil personality too. Because the brothers of Joseph are not good, at least they're unrepentant sinners. Remember they say that we will kill Joseph and we shall become a righteous people afterwards. Remember? Yeah? وَكُونُوا قَوْمًا صَالِحِينَ, right? Sorry, I can't remember the exact quotation. But so the ayat are very strange. A secular critic would say they're too promiscuous. The range is too large. Love for a wife, an evil personality, a demand by a prophet. All this is covered by this one word, ayah, ayat plural. Well, then what use is such a word? It seems to have such a massive range. Well, of course, the answer to that is that vis-a-vis nature itself, the natural world, what the Quran is implying through the use of this word is that nature is a subject, not an object. Right? An object would be that you can, as Francis Bacon said, you can twist it, you can squeeze answers out of nature, you can subject it to experiments, and then with the knowledge you can create an auxiliary technology. The Quran seems to say no, the attitude towards nature should be more reverent because behind nature is God. Right? Nature is not an autonomous reality simply for scientific investigation, exploitation of nature, and for the building of a technology that may itself be actually quite destructive, as we've now found out, living in the age of nuclear technology. Right? So the idea is that what the ayat do is that they are a mediation between the transcendent reality of God and the natural reality of the human located inquirer, such as myself. Yeah? I'm the scientist or the poet looking at the world. Yeah? The puzzle, however, is that some people, including very distinguished physicists and scientists and very distinguished poets who have tremendous aesthetic powers, say that there is nothing behind nature. Nature is a datum which is final. There's no God behind it. This is the challenge for the believer, to say that there is a God behind it and that you've missed that. That's part of what I try to do in my book. The mind, whether I've succeeded or not is difficult to say. I mean, I've not managed to convert any of my atheist philosophical colleagues to Islam, right? And it's unthinkable for them. But one of them was saying actually that he would convert to Islam, but he can't do without his fine wines. So yeah, I'm just quoting him. So and of course that's a bad objection. I said to him, that's not a good reason for not becoming a Muslim because you can't live without champagne. Very optimistic epistemology because it implies that something widely available, the routine sequences of the seasons, autumn, winter, something routine and easily observable to those who've been given the faculties of the eyes and the hearing and the heart, as the Quran says, right, is available to everyone, so that we're all philosophers in that sense. Because remember that natural wisdom requires some training, which is I'm going to come on to now, where the Quranic evidences are which make me doubt this distinction. Remember, the only thing that does not require training is prejudice. We're all naturally prejudiced. We don't need to be trained in it. Right? There's no session saying, I'll teach you how to be prejudiced, because that's our default state, unfortunately, as human beings. We're all prejudiced, right? Question is, how do we reduce those prejudices through knowledge? Yeah? Or how we refuse to implement those prejudices. Even when we're powerful, we say, I refuse to implement my private prejudice against this group because I'm harming them. But as far as knowledge is concerned, it requires some training. So what is the training that the Quran gives people, which makes me wonder whether the Quran itself already contains both types of theologies, which if we develop the natural theology, maybe if we become better scientists and believers at the same time, perhaps we will be able to make a case that will convince secular atheists and very good quantum physicists and chemists and biologists and evolutionary biologists that, look, you're being too blasé and casual in dismissing the possibility of God. That's actually my project, is what I'm trying to do at the moment. So where in the Quran, somebody might say, is there any evidence that these two types of theology are not actually distinct? Remember I said that in Christian theology, natural theology means unaided human natural reason and what it can come up with. And in the past, this was a very ambitious discipline. So for example, if you look at Aquinas, he has 5 ways, which he probably plagiarized from some Muslim philosopher of the previous centuries. 5 ways in which you can demonstrate on the basis of what you observe, about everything as a cause, there must be a final cause, that's God, right? I won't go into it, the cosmological argument, there must be a sufficient reason why the world is in existence, because everything that is in existence has a reason to be in existence. The only sufficient reason for the cosmos to be in existence is God, just like the sufficient necessary and sufficient reason for my existence is my parents, right? The fact they brought me to the world, and for the whole cosmos. And then this argument, the design argument, that everything seems teleological, meaning everything seems adapted. Our eyes, for example, are capable of looking. Did somebody design them in this way? Is there a wonderful engineer? Somebody designed the aeroplane. So the cosmos being a more sophisticated version of an aeroplane, is there a God who's the final architect? Some of these arguments, right? Unfortunately, all of them have come under tremendous amount of attack in the last 300 years by philosophers, roughly beginning with David Hume, who was the first great philosopher to separate theology from philosophy. Because remember, philosophy is the mother discipline of all other disciplines. What's the name of the highest degree awarded to someone? Doctor of? Yeah. In your subject, theology, geology, my case, Doctor of Philosophy, in philosophy. Sorry, I'm showing off a bit about my subject now by saying that. But, it is the mother discipline. Yeah? Meaning it's as old as art, as poetry. It's not like, say, sociology and biochemistry, which both came to existence about, 50 years ago? I think biochemistry was founded only 100 years ago. I'm not sure, but I'm saying it's obviously recent, yeah. Philosophy, very ancient. Yeah. What's the evidence then? And then I'll stop after that to take questions, and I'll continue further. Just this final point to fill in this whole frame. It's a very complex subject. Where in the Quran, you might say, is there any reason to think that natural theology should be right? Well, obviously, there's the motto of the Islamic Renaissance Front, it's for people who think. Yeah? So obviously, natural theology implies thinking. But not only that, not only does the Quran issue frequently this generic command, for tadabbur, deep reflection, right? To have tafakkar, to have thinking, afala tafakkarun, afala taqilun, will they not understand? It's a very frequent Quranic claim. Of course, the atheist may object and say, yes, but that's just limited thinking. The Quran is asking you to think to verify its credentials as the word of God. Were you to think anarchically or subversively and come to the conclusion that it's not the word of God, then it would be self-defeating. Obviously, the Quran is not encouraging you to think like an atheist. It's saying think as a believer, meaning with reverence and gratitude, so it deepens the life of your spirituality. It's not asking you to think anarchically. But the point is the Quran is asking you to think, though, which implies that you have a faculty, like your nafs al-lawwama, your conscience, which blames you. There's a faculty that makes you think, ask questions. Right? So the fact that we have that is one argument for thinking that we can develop a natural theology, because it encourages curiosity, which is the basis of disciplined scientific inquiry. It's not an accident, by the way, that it was Islamic civilization that produced natural science to begin with, which was later institutionalized by the medieval universities, the feudal universities of Europe, Paris and Bologna and Oxford and Cambridge. And of course, the Muslims did take, borrow the numerical system of the Indian mathematics. But the point is that they synthesized it, they had curiosity, they were powerful, because intellectual curiosity is partly the byproduct of political power. Only powerful people are curious. That's why Muslims aren't curious, because we're not powerful. We are weak. Generically, we're given this commandment all the time. The more interesting question is, where in the Quran does it say anything in the verses of the Quran? I'm sure some of you are probably Huffaz here, Hafiz of the Quran. I'm functionally a Hafiz, meaning I can more or less locate every verse, but I don't know it chronologically. Where does it say that you should look at the phenomena of nature in some kind of detail, in the development of natural theory? Well, doesn't it comment upon the orbits of the planets? Now, I don't want to go into this argument which says that, all of Quran has got concealed meanings which are scientific. You can find embryology. I don't actually believe that's true. I think the book is essentially a religious exhortation, right? And there are things in the Quran which are fully compatible with the findings of physiology and astronomy, but I don't think these verses themselves can be mined for scientific potential, because then the problem is you're making the authority of the Quran dependent upon the authority of current science. Well, what if science changes next day? Then you'd have to do a new tafsir, right? So I don't believe in the argument. But the idea of curiosity, the Quran makes some strange comments, like, it says that, I think it's Surah Furqan, that if we had desired, we could have made the shadow stationary. The shadow of objects which moves when the sun declines. Right? Here in Malaysia, you see well, not on a day like this, but you see the shadows, changing their length, for example. What a strange thing to say in a book of revelation about spirituality. What's the relevance of that? It's as if God himself, is directing your human intelligence and saying, have you considered what are the implications of the fact that the length of the shadow changes different times of the day? It's a dalil, yeah? It's an argument. Yeah? It's a strange thing to say. Perhaps you know the verse I'm talking about, to believe. That's the one. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. We could have made it sakinan. We could have made it stationary, but we didn't. What a strange thing to say in a way. So it says what we call in science a heuristic principle, meaning it stimulates thought in your mind. If you're a scientist, if you're curious, you say, God has said in the Quran that we could have made the shadow stationary. What are the implications of that? In other words, you're doing a bit of what may be called subjunctive counterfactual science. What if water didn't boil at 100 but at 120? What if all life did not originate in water, which is a Quranic claim, incidentally, that all things are made from water? What if modern science has questioned that and saying that methane, which is an alternative carbon product, may also actually sustain life even on this planet? And they're saying that all of life on Titan, which is one of the moons of Jupiter, is actually methane-based. Is that some kind of a challenge to the Muslim who's a believer as well as a scientist? That's what I meant by saying that the Quran seems to me to contain some verses, and in my latest article, which is going to be published soon, or is probably already published, I gave a list of all these ayat which are the basis of a positive natural theology. Remember, not revealed. The revealed bit is the fact that the Quran has told us, you're created beings, we've sent prophets to you. Even if that may not be evident to your reason, how many prophets came, the Quran is telling you. After all, the Quran says, as a precondition of performing the salat, Allazina yu'minuna bil ghaib, they believe in the mysterious. So you need to do that bit before you do the, ikamat as-salat. You're not going to establish prayer if you're a skeptic. What I mean by that is that, you know how some of the practices of Buddhism have been uprooted from their Buddhist metaphysics and made simply into a form of physical exercise, like yoga in Hinduism. You can do yoga while not being a Hindu. It's impossible for a person to do salat without being a Muslim. If you're a secular humanist, you say, I don't believe in the ghaib, but I'm going to pray. It doesn't actually make any sense. You can make all the movements psychologically, where you have to, in Islam, as you know, you have to touch your knees, and then you go into an actual full, complete prostration, right? Can somebody do that without believing in the ghaib? Could somebody perform prayer like a ghaib-less prayer, so to speak? Is it possible? I mean, it would be a very odd person, firstly, I suppose, who did this, right? Who said, I'm a secular humanist metaphysician, and I'm trying to behave like a Muslim, but I'm only trying to behave externally. I don't believe in it. I think it would be a very odd choice, wouldn't it? Because in Islam, this seems to be integrated. This seems to be organic. Those who believe and do righteous deeds, yeah? Shall I stop now? Yeah, all right. So I think I've put enough material there in your mind. I mean, certainly when I've lectured in parts of the world, less true at Oxford, where people don't seem to react to any of this. People have often said, yeah, there's a lot of questions here, but I think in Malaysia somebody said to me, my last exchange at International Islamic University, a student said to me, she said, sir, you ask a lot of questions, but you don't give any answers, and yet you call yourself a professor. I said, yeah, that's a very good objection. She said, you profess to have knowledge, but you ask all these questions and you say, please think about it for the next class. But I thought you were the professor. I mean, aren't there any answers? I hope nobody's going to react like that today. Thank you. All right, well, I'll stop and ask you to ask me, and
Any questions from the floor? Because I, for one, think or trying to figure out, because I think like you said, you've highlighted a lot of questions, and you introduced the concept of natural theologies and the verses in the Quran that suggest that. But in what way does it answers the questions of God's silences?
Yes.
I think is the part where it's
okay. Let me speak a bit more about that. Fair point. In the Jewish tradition and in the Christian tradition, there is a feeling that God is silent, meaning he doesn't react. What's called apophatic theology. Apophatic meaning negative theology, right? Well, a bit like Bila Kaif, without asking how, right? That people, Muslims, Jews, Christians, they all wish that God would speak, not merely through the grandeur of nature, through the ayat, but have a literal revelation. So for example, in this age where there's a deadlock between monotheism and atheism, what if God were to speak? Let's say the Arabic kalima appeared in front of the windows of all the world's top leading physicists as they were working in their offices. They're working in the office, they look up and they say, oh my God, what's this? And then one of their Muslim colleagues says, that's the kalima in Arabic. They said, yeah, but how is it mysteriously appearing outside my window? Is it a trick performed by the physics department? He said, no, it's no trick. You can go and check on the physics department. They've all themselves got this thing. In other words, a dramatic miracle has occurred, which has disambiguated nature. Nature is no longer ambivalent, both capable of sustaining religious interpretations and secular interpretation. Now it's been decisively cut. Of course, Muslims would disagree with that because they would say that the Quran actually is the miraculous book which has disambiguated nature. After the Quran, it's obvious to anyone who thinks that nature declares the glory of God, and that the only thing that now remains is post-mortem verification, which means when you die, right? When you die and you're a Muslim, the question, the catechism in the grave is simple. Who's your Lord? You talk a bit about your aqidah. And then the next part's a bit harder, where they look at the record of your actions, and some of us at least will appeal for the Prophet's intercession. Right? Some of us probably don't need to if we've done lots of good things, but most of us, I suspect, will say, well, I don't think I've passed this part. Now, Christians would say, well, we have our own catechism, especially Catholics, very developed catechism, which says that, if you're a Catholic, when you're asked in the grave, presumably about the status of Mary, the Mother of God, you answer all the questions. Of course, we have an incompatible view. We think that if somebody gave those answers, they are in trouble, because it's a kind of associationism or shirk to say that the Messiah is God. The Quran says, "Laqad kafaru," such people have disbelieved who say the Messiah is God himself, right? So we got these incompatible views. So the only thing that will resolve this in the context of God's current silence is if he doesn't speak now, is post-mortem verification. We arise in a different world. Now, the atheist says there's no post-mortem verification. We will enter a state of oblivion. Therefore, you Muslims will not be in a position to laugh at us and say, oh, you guys were wrong. Because nobody will be laughing, right? You're in a state of oblivion. Nothing's going to happen. That's what the atheist will say. Buddhists will say, well, you know, all this idea of hell and heaven, God judging us, God expecting us to control our urges and our desires for wealth and sexuality when he himself has planted them inside us, is all unfair anyway. You know, different people react differently to this bit of this narrative. So in the absence of God giving a decisive answer while we're living, the only thing that remains is post-mortem verification. In other words, a continuing stalemate or deadlock between all the conflicting parties making different claims, and yet no one is saying it. Now, I'll just thank you, by the way, for reminding me about the silence bit. I just want to add one bit, which I think is slightly different for us Muslims. There was actually an incident in the life of Muhammad Iqbal, the Indian poet philosopher, where he wrote a shikwa or complaint against God. And he also wrote afterwards, under the pressure of a fatwa, an answer to the same complaint himself, right, to save his skin. But in the complaint, he basically says to God, you know, you're always asking Muslims to be good and virtuous, and yet, you know, how is it that most of the blessings of the world are given to non-Muslim nations? You know, that seems a very odd thing, you know. So he's complaining to God, we Muslims have done this, done that, and yet we're still being punished. And there's, you know, bad people in the world who are disbelievers, they get so many luxuries. And part of the divine answer to him is that the Muslims you are boasting about are dead and gone. They are the early generation. You've not done any of these things, Iqbal, have you? You've not conquered any territories or lived a spectacular life as a general, winning wars for Islam. So why are you complaining? Now, the point is that this was a complaint because God does not speak. And, you know, he says nature speaks. Right? Nature speaks about God. It declares God in some hidden way. But it's not explicit. I wish, he says as a poet, that God were to directly speak and end this stalemate so that all the kuffar and the people of the Ahl al-Kitab would all know decisively, yes, Islam is the truth. But of course, God doesn't do that. He's too subtle. Yeah? Latif. Yeah? Inna Allah latifun khabir. He's too subtle to do that. Something so blunt and crass as to, you know, openly, you know, write these slogans, or, you know, as I'm lecturing, a thunder occurs, some earthquake. You're not in the earthquake zone, right, in Malaysia. But something dramatic occurs anyway while I'm talking. And you say, look, there's a sign of God, that what you've said is blasphemous. Or what Dr. Taj just said is blasphemous, probably more like it. You'd probably get a thunder for that. So I think that for Jews, post-Holocaust, God is silent simply meant that, I mean, na'uzubillah min zalik, we can't say that, but that God had died. This is Nietzsche's idea, God is dead. Right, which is a dramatic way of saying that the world will now have to be interpreted according to our own desires. We must impose an interpretation on the world. There is no objective moral truth or existential truth in the universe itself that you can discover through any kind of inquiry or teleology or purpose. You must impose purpose. Life is pointless, therefore you give life a point. Yeah? Well, how do you do that? You join a yoga class, right? Or you decide to lose weight, or you go and start traveling, or you make a resolve that I will do good things in the world. But for Jews, God has died simply means that the witness of the God of Abraham, Yahweh, is in effect in the modern world. And you meet many secular rabbis like Reform Judaism, which is effectively a disguised form of secular humanism, because the God element has been removed. Thank you, by the way, for asking me to add that. Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted me to add, or are you happy for me to stop now?